A pig nearly plunged two world powers into war. A wooden carving spied on an ambassador for 7 years, its secrets only revealed by accident. And an argument over trimming a single tree in a demilitarized zone led to a deadly international showdown involving axes and soldiers on high alert. Get ready to dive into some of the strangest moments when global politics went completely off the rails. Number 9. That time, a pig almost caused a war between America and Britain. Imagine a tiny, beautiful island. So beautiful, in fact, that two of the world's biggest powers both wanted it. This was San Juan Island, nestled between the mainland United States and Vancouver Island back in the mid-1800s. After the Oregon Treaty of 1846, which was supposed to settle the border between American and British territory in the Pacific Northwest, there was a bit of a muddle. The treaty said the border should run through the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver's island. But oops, there were two channels it could mean: Haro Strait or Rosario Strait. San Juan Island sat right in between. So both American settlers and British subjects from the Hudson's Bay Company started living there. Things were mostly peaceful, if a little awkward, until June 15th, 1859. On that day, an American farmer named Lyman Cutler found a rather large black pig digging up his potato patch. This wasn't the first time. Fed up, Cutler took his gun and shot the pig. Dead. Now, this pig wasn't just any pig. It belonged to Charles Griffin, an Irishman who worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. Cutler went to Griffin and offered to pay $10 for the deceased porker. Griffin, however, wasn't having it. He demanded $100. Cutler reportedly said he hadn't shot a $100 pig and that the pig was trespassing anyway. Griffin fumed. Word got to the British authorities. They weren't too pleased about an American citizen shooting a British pig on what they considered British soil. They threatened to arrest Cutler. The American settlers, feeling their rights were being trampled, called for U.S. military protection. The U.S. Army obliged, sending over Captain George Pickett. Yes, that George Pickett, who would later become famous for a certain charge at Gettysburg, along with 66 soldiers from the 9th U.S. Infantry. Pickett landed on July 27, 1859, and declared the entire island U.S. property. The British were, to put it mildly, annoyed. James Douglas, the governor of British Columbia, decided to show some muscle. He sent 3 British warships under Captain Geoffrey Hornby to the island. Suddenly, those 66 American soldiers were facing down Royal Marines cannons and ships that could easily blast them off the map. Pickett, not one to back down, reportedly told his men, "We'll make a Bunker Hill of it." The situation was incredibly tense. Reinforcements poured in on both sides. By August, nearly 500 American soldiers with 14 cannons were staring at 5 British warships carrying over 2,000 men and more than 70 cannons. One wrong move, one itchy trigger finger, and it could have been all-out war. Luckily, news of this porcine-provoked crisis eventually reached Washington, D.C. and London. Officials on both sides were, shall we say, less than enthusiastic about going to war over a pig. Rear Admiral Robert L. Baines, commander of the British naval forces in the Pacific, arrived and was appalled. He famously told Governor Douglas that he would not involve 2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig. Wise words. Cooler heads began to prevail. Negotiations started. Both sides agreed to a joint military occupation of San Juan Island, with each nation maintaining a camp of no more than 100 men. This slightly bizarre arrangement lasted for the next 12 years. The soldiers actually got along quite well. reportedly visiting each other's camps and celebrating holidays together. Finally, in 1871, Britain and the United States submitted the San Juan boundary dispute to international arbitration by Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany. In 1872, the Kaiser ruled in favor of the United States, deciding that Harrow Strait was the correct channel, thus awarding San Juan Island to America. The only casualty in the entire pig war was, thankfully, the pig itself. Number 8. The case of the severed ear that sparked a decade of conflict. Imagine being a sea captain in the 1700s, sailing the Caribbean. It's a risky business, full of pirates, privateers, and rival navies, all jostling for trade and territory. Now imagine having your ear sliced off by a Spanish Coast Guard officer who then tells you to take it back to your king and tell him what happens to smugglers. That's exactly what allegedly happened to Captain Robert Jenkins, a British mariner. This was back in 1731. Jenkins was commanding the brig Rebecca, trading between Britain and its colonies in the West Indies. According to Jenkins, his ship was boarded by the Spanish privateer La Isabela, commanded by Juan de Leon Fandino, off the coast of Havana. The Spanish were legally allowed to board British ships in Spanish waters to check for contraband as per the Treaty of Seville. However, Jenkins claimed Fandino's men ransacked his ship, tortured him, and then Fandino himself lopped off Jenkins' ear with his sword. Fandino allegedly told Jenkins, "Go and tell your king that I will do the same if he dares to do the same." Gruesome stuff. Jenkins, presumably with a well-bandaged head, eventually made it back to Britain. Now, here's where it gets a bit hazy. Did he immediately rush to Parliament and present his pickled ear as evidence of Spanish brutality? Popular story says yes, but historical records are a bit thin on an immediate uproar. It seems the incident was reported, but didn't cause a huge diplomatic storm right away. Fast forward 7 years to 1738, tensions between Great Britain and Spain were sky high. British merchants were furious about Spanish interference with their lucrative and sometimes illicit trade in the Caribbean. Smuggling was rampant, and the Spanish Guardia Costa were equally zealous in trying to stop it, often with heavy-handed tactics. There was a strong anti-Spanish sentiment brewing in Britain, fueled by a vocal opposition in Parliament, eager to push Prime Minister Robert Walpole into a more aggressive foreign policy. This is when Captain Jenkins and his ear, or the story of his ear, made a dramatic comeback. Jenkins was called to testify before a committee of the House of Commons. According to some accounts, he dramatically produced the severed ear, possibly preserved in a jar of spirits, as evidence of Spanish cruelty. Whether he actually showed the ear or just recounted the tale with great pathos, it had a massive impact. His story, a perfect symbol of Spanish aggression and British humiliation, inflamed public opinion. Pamphlets and patriotic poems circulated. The cry for war grew louder. Politicians seized on the Jenkins Ear incident as a rallying point. The opposition, led by figures like William Pitt the Elder, used it to attack Walpole's policy of peace with Spain, accusing him of weakness. Pressure became immense, despite Walpole's efforts to find a diplomatic solution. Like the Convention of Pardo, which tried to settle compensation claims, but satisfied no one, the war hawks won. In October 1739, Great Britain declared war on Spain. This conflict, which lasted until 1748, became known quite literally as the War of Jenkins' Ear. It eventually merged into the larger War of the Austrian Succession, drawing in other European powers. So a single, alleged act of violence against one sea captain, magnified by political opportunism and national pride, contributed to years of widespread warfare, costing thousands of lives and vast sums of money. All because of a story about a severed ear, a potent symbol in a very tense time. Number 7. When a pastry chef's grievance cooked up an international blockade. Picture this. Mexico City, 1838. Country was a bit chaotic. It had gained independence from Spain not too long ago, and there had been several changes in government, coups, and general unrest. Foreigners living in Mexico, including French citizens, often found their businesses damaged or looted during these periods of instability, with little hope of getting any compensation from the Mexican government. Enter Monsieur Remontel. He was a French pastry chef living in Tacubaya, near Mexico City. Sometime around 1828, during one of these bouts of disorder, Mexican army officers allegedly ransacked his pastry shop. They didn't just steal a few eclairs. They reportedly caused significant damage and consumed a lot of his goods without paying. Remontel, quite understandably, was miffed. He, along with other French nationals who had suffered losses, complained to the French government. For years, these claims simmered. The French government, under King Louis-Philippe, had been trying to get Mexico to pay up for various damages suffered by French citizens. Claims totaled around 600,000 pesos, which was a hefty sum back then. Monsieur Remontel's pastry shop damages were a small, but apparently very memorable part of this larger claim. The Mexican government, dealing with its own internal problems and financial instability, largely ignored these demands or dragged its feet. By 1838, France had had enough. King Louis-Philippe decided it was time to get serious. He sent a fleet under Rear Admiral Charles Baudin to Mexico. Baudin arrived off the coast of Veracruz, Mexico's main Gulf port, with an ultimatum: pay the 600,000 pesos, or else. The Mexican government, led by President Anastasio Bustamante, refused. They felt the claims were excessive and an affront to their national sovereignty. They particularly balked at some of the individual claims, like Remontel's, which they found trivial compared to the threat of foreign intervention. So what did France do? They blockaded Veracruz in April 1838. This was a big deal. Veracruz was crucial for Mexican trade. Blockade started to strangle the Mexican economy. In November, after months of fruitless negotiation, Baudin decided to escalate. French forces bombarded and then captured the fortress of San Juan de Ulua, which guarded Veracruz harbor. During the fighting, a rather famous figure on the Mexican side, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, yes, the Alamo guy, came out of retirement to lead the defense of Veracruz. In one skirmish, Santa Anna was severely wounded in the leg by French cannon fire. His leg had to be amputated. He later had the leg buried with full military honors, which is a whole other bizarre story. Conflict, which lasted from November 1838 to March 1839, became known as the Pastry War, Guerra de los Pastels in Spanish, precisely because of the prominent if somewhat exaggerated role of Monsieur Remontel's plundered pastries in the French justification for action. It was a symbol of the seemingly minor grievances that had snowballed into a major international incident. Eventually, with British diplomatic mediation, a peace treaty was signed in March 1839. Mexico agreed to pay the 600,000 pesos to France. The French withdrew their fleet, and the war was over. But it left a bitter taste. It highlighted how European powers could use relatively small grievances, or gunboat diplomacy, to impose their will on weaker nations. And it all started, at least in popular memory, with a bunch of looted cakes and pastries. Number 6. The night a Russian fleet accidentally attacked British fishermen, thinking they were the enemy. It's October 1904. The Russo-Japanese War is raging in the Far East. Russia's Pacific Fleet has taken a beating, so Tsar Nicholas II decides to send his Baltic Fleet all the way around the world, a journey of over 18,000 nautical miles, to turn the tide of the war. This massive fleet, commanded by Admiral Zinovy Rochestvensky, was a mix of modern battleships and older, less reliable vessels. Spirits were probably a bit low, and nerves were definitely frayed. As the fleet steamed out of the Baltic Sea and into the North Sea, rumors were flying. Russian intelligence, which wasn't exactly top-notch, had suggested that Japanese torpedo boats, possibly disguised as fishing trawlers, might be lurking in European waters to ambush them. Yes, Japanese torpedo boats, thousands of miles from Japan, in the North Sea. It sounds far-fetched now. But in the paranoid atmosphere of wartime, some Russian officers apparently believed. On the night of October 21st and into the early morning of October 22nd, the Russian fleet was passing through the Dogger Bank area, a well-known fishing ground heavily used by British trawlers from Hull. It was foggy. Visibility was poor. Suddenly, a Russian officer on one of the battleships, the Knyaz Suvorov, spotted what he thought were suspicious vessels. Green flares were seen, which were interpreted as signals from Japanese torpedo boats. Panic ensued. Without proper identification, and likely fueled by fear and inexperience, many crewmen were fresh recruits. The Russian warships opened fire. For about 20 chaotic minutes, shells rained down, not on cunning Japanese destroyers, but on the unsuspecting British fishing fleet. The trawler Crane was sunk, and its captain and first mate were killed. Several other trawlers were damaged, and 6 other fishermen were injured, one of whom later died from his wounds. To make matters even more absurd in the confusion, some Russian ships even fired on each other. Cruisers Aurora, later famous in the Russian Revolution, and Dmitry Donskoy were hit by friendly fire, and at least one sailor and a priest aboard the Aurora were killed. When dawn broke and the smoke cleared, the horror of the mistake became apparent. The Russian fleet, instead of stopping to help the stricken fishermen, simply sailed on, leaving the British to pick up their dead and wounded. News of the Dogger Bank incident, or the Hull outrage, as it was called in Britain, caused an absolute uproar. The British public was furious. How could the Russian Navy mistake their fishing boats for enemy warships and then just flee the scene? Demands for retribution were loud. Newspapers screamed for war. The Royal Navy was put on alert, and its home fleet shadowed the Russian fleet as it continued its journey south. For a terrifying moment, it looked like Britain, an ally of Japan, might be drawn into war against Russia. Diplomacy went into overdrive. The Russian government, realizing the colossal blunder, offered profound apologies and agreed to an international commission of inquiry held in Paris under the Hague Convention. Admiral Rochestvensky, while continuing his voyage, claimed his ships had indeed been attacked by torpedo boats, but this was widely disbelieved. Commission, which included admirals from Britain, Russia, France, the United States, and Austria-Hungary, concluded in February 1905 that there were no Japanese torpedo boats present and that the firing was unjustified. Criticized Rochestvensky for not informing the British authorities about his fleet's passage through the North Sea and for not stopping to render aid. Russia ended up paying £65,000, a very large sum at the time, in compensation to the fishermen and their families. War was averted, but the incident severely damaged Anglo-Russian relations for years, and for Admiral Rochestvensky's ill-fated Baltic fleet. After its disastrous voyage of the damned, it finally reached the Far East only to be annihilated by the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905. The Dogger Bank incident was just one more inglorious chapter in its tragic journey. Number 5. The gift that kept on listening in. for 7 whole years. It was 1945. World War II was drawing to a close, and the Soviet Union and the United States were allies. Sort of. But the seeds of the Cold War were already being sown. In Moscow, the U.S. ambassador was W. Avro Harriman. As a gesture of friendship, or so it seemed, a delegation from the Young Pioneer Organization of the Soviet Union, think Soviet Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, presented Ambassador Harriman with a very special gift, a large, hand-carved wooden replica of the Great Seal of the United States. It was quite an impressive piece of craftsmanship. Harriman, pleased with this token of goodwill, hung it on the wall of his office in Spaso House, the U.S. ambassador's residence in Moscow, and there it stayed for 7 years. Through Harriman's tenure, and that of his successor, Ambassador Walter Bedell Smith, and then Ambassador George F. Kennan, it hung there silently, witnessing countless private conversations, high-level meetings, and the dictation of secret cables back to Washington. What no one in the U.S. Embassy knew was that this beautiful carving was not just a gift. It was a Trojan horse, a remarkably ingenious listening device. It was so clever that it didn't need any batteries or wires. It was a passive resonant cavity microphone, invented by the brilliant Soviet scientist Leon Theremin, who also invented the theremin musical instrument. Here's how it worked. In simple terms, the device, later nicknamed the Thing or the Great Seal Bug, contained a tiny diaphragm that would vibrate with sound waves from conversations in the room. The Soviets, from a van or a nearby building, would beam a radio signal at the Great Seal. This signal would make a resonant cavity inside the bug vibrate, and the diaphragm's vibrations, caused by the voices, would modulate the reflected radio signal. The Soviets could then pick up this modulated signal and hear everything being said. It was cutting-edge spy technology for its time, almost undetectable by conventional bug-sweeping methods, because it was only active when the Soviets were illuminating it with their radio beam. For 7 long years, the Soviets listened in. Imagine the intelligence coup. They could hear the U.S. ambassador's private thoughts, discussions about policy, negotiations, everything. Security sweeps of the embassy were conducted, but the Thing remained undiscovered. The discovery finally came in 1952, almost by accident. Ambassador Kennan was in post. A British radio operator monitoring Soviet Air Force radio traffic picked up American voices on a channel where they shouldn't have been. He alerted the Americans. Security officials at the embassy launched an extremely thorough new sweep. This time, they were looking for something that might be activated by an external signal. Eventually, they zeroed in on the Great Seal. When they carefully took it apart, they found the tiny, sophisticated device hidden inside. American intelligence experts were initially baffled by its design. It was unlike anything they had seen before. It took them a while to figure out exactly how it worked. The U.S. government decided to keep the discovery of the Thing a closely guarded secret for several years. They didn't want the Soviets to know they knew. They also studied the device intensely to learn from its design. Public revelation finally came in 1960. After the Soviets shot down an American U-2 spy plane over their territory, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., dramatically unveiled the Great Seal Bug during a UN Security Council meeting. He showed the dismantled seal and the tiny microphone to expose Soviet espionage and hypocrisy, pointing out that while the Soviets were complaining about American spying, they had been doing this for years. The Thing is now a famous backup of Cold War espionage, a testament to Soviet ingenuity and a chilling reminder of how a seemingly innocent gift became one of the most successful covert listening operations in history. Number 4. The day a tree trimming dispute exploded into an axe-wielding international crisis. The Korean Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, is one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth. It's a thin strip of land separating North and South Korea, a place of constant tension since the Korean War ended in an armistice, not a peace treaty, in 1953. Within the DMZ is the Joint Security Area, JSA, at Panmunjom, where North and South Korean forces stand face to face. It's supposed to be a neutral zone for diplomatic engagement, but it's always been a powder keg. On August 18, 1976, this powder keg nearly ignited. The incident started over something seemingly trivial: a large poplar tree. This tree, about 40 feet tall, was located near the Bridge of No Return in the JSA. During the summer, its leaves were obstructing the line of sight between a United Nations Command (UNC) checkpoint and a UNC observation post. This was a security concern for the American and South Korean forces stationed there. So, a routine work detail was sent out to trim the tree. The group consisted of 5 South Korean Service Corps personnel, supervised by their South Korean Army Captain Kim Moon-hwan and his American counterpart, Captain Arthur Boniface of the U.S. Army. They also had a security escort of 11 American and South Korean soldiers, including Boniface's platoon leader, First Lieutenant Mark Barrett. They brought axes and tools for the job. As they began trimming, a group of North Korean soldiers, led by a senior lieutenant named Pak Chul, arrived on the scene. Initially, Pak Chul didn't object to the tree trimming, and for about 15 to 20 minutes, the work continued. Then, suddenly, Pak Chul demanded that the trimming stop, claiming the tree had been planted by Kim Il-sung himself and was growing under his personal supervision, a claim later found to be untrue. Captain Boniface ordered his men to continue trimming. Pak Chul then sent for reinforcements. Shortly after, about 20 more North Korean soldiers arrived in a truck, armed with crowbars and clubs. Pak Chul again ordered the UNC team to stop. Captain Boniface again refused and turned his back. What happened next was brutal and swift. According to UNC reports, Pak Chul shouted, "Kill the bastards!" and the North Korean soldiers swarmed the UNC group. They used the axes dropped by the tree trimmers, along with the clubs and crowbars they brought, to attack the unarmed Boniface and Barrett. Captain Boniface was bludgeoned to death almost immediately. Lieutenant Barrett was also fatally wounded. The other UNC and South Korean personnel fought back, but they were outnumbered and mostly unarmed against the frenzied attack. Many were injured before they could disengage and retreat. The entire horrific incident lasted only about 30 to 40 seconds. The international reaction was one of shock and outrage. The U.S. government, under President Gerald Ford, was furious. This was a direct, unprovoked attack on American military personnel in an area supposedly meant for peaceful dialogue. The situation escalated rapidly. The U.S. put its forces in Korea on high alert, DEFCON 3. There was serious consideration given to retaliatory military strikes against North Korea. Instead of immediate military reprisal, President Ford approved Operation Paul Bunyan. 3 days later, on August 21st, a massive show of force was mounted. A convoy of 23 American and South Korean vehicles rolled into the JSA. Engineers, armed with chainsaws, were there to cut down the poplar tree completely, not just trim it. Protecting them was a heavily armed task force of 30 American soldiers from the Joint Security Force, plus 64 South Korean Special Forces soldiers armed with M16 rifles, claymore mines strapped to their chests with the triggers in their hands, and taekwondo experts. But that wasn't all. In the skies above, B-52 Stratofortress bombers from Guam, escorted by US F-4 Phantom II and South Korean F-5 Freedom fighter jets, flew menacingly close to the DMZ. F-111 fighter bombers were also airborne. The aircraft carrier USS Midway was moved offshore. Artillery units were on high alert, aimed at North Korean positions. It was an overwhelming display of military might, all to cut down one tree. The North Koreans, reportedly, were taken by surprise by the scale of the operation. They deployed about 150 to 200 soldiers with machine guns, but they wisely chose not to intervene as the tree was felled in 42 minutes. After the tree was down, North Korea's leader, Kim Il-sung, did something very unusual. He issued a statement expressing regret over the incident, though he stopped short of a full apology and didn't admit North Korean responsibility. It was enough to de-escalate the crisis. Tensions remained high, but large-scale conflict was averted. The axe murder incident, as it became known, was a chilling reminder of how quickly a small dispute in the DMZ could spiral into a major international confrontation with potentially devastating consequences. The stump of the tree was later replaced by a monument. Number 3. The medieval war that, maybe, started over a stolen bucket. Let's travel way back in time to 14th century Italy. The Italian peninsula wasn't a unified country then. It was a patchwork of powerful city-states, often feuding with each other over land trade and political influence. Two such rival cities were Bologna and Modena, located in the Emilia-Romagna region. Bologna generally supported the Pope. They were Guelphs, while Modena often sided with the Holy Roman Emperor. They were Ghibellines. This Guelph-Ghibelline rivalry was a major source of conflict throughout Italy for centuries. So, Bologna and Modena already had a long history of not liking each other very much. Border skirmishes, raids, and general bad blood were common. But in 1325, things escalated into a full-blown war, a conflict that has become famous for its supposedly bizarre trigger: a stolen wooden bucket. The story, which has an almost legendary quality, goes like this. A group of Modenese soldiers snuck into the city of Bologna. They didn't set fires or attack anyone. Instead, they managed to steal a large oaken bucket from a well in the city center and carried it back to Modena as a trophy. The Bolognese, understandably, were outraged by this theft and the insult it represented. They demanded the return of their bucket. The Modenese, proud of their cheeky heist, refused. And so legend says, Bologna declared war on Modena to get their bucket back. This conflict culminated in the Battle of Zappolino on November 15, 1325. It was a surprisingly large and bloody battle. Modena, despite being outnumbered, with around 2,000 cavalry and 5,000 infantry, managed to decisively defeat the Bolognese forces, who had about 2,000 cavalry and a massive 30,000 infantry. The Modenese, led by Passerino Bonacolsi, Lord of Mantua, who was allied with Modena, pursued the retreating Bolognese all the way back to the gates of Bologna, taunting them by destroying several castles and even holding mock games outside the city walls before finally withdrawing. Thousands were killed in the battle. Now, did this major war, one of the largest medieval battles involving Italian city-states, really happen just because of a stolen bucket? Historians today generally think the bucket incident was more of a symbolic trigger, or perhaps even a story that grew in the telling, rather than the sole cause of the war. The deep-seated political rivalries, territorial disputes, and the ongoing Guelph-Ghibelline power struggle were the real underlying reasons. The bucket might have been the final straw, a convenient pretext, or a piece of propaganda that captured the imagination. What is certain is that a wooden bucket, said to be the bucket, is still preserved and displayed in Modena, in the Torre della Ghirlandina, the bell tower of Modena Cathedral. It's treated as a precious relic, a symbol of Modenese triumph. Whether it's the actual bucket from 1325 is debatable, but its symbolic power is undeniable. The War of the Oaken Bucket, as it's sometimes called, didn't actually result in the bucket's return to Bologna. Modena kept it. The war itself further entrenched the animosity between the two cities for a long time. While peace was eventually made, mediated by the Pope, the memory of the conflict and its peculiar alleged cause lived on. It's a fascinating example of how a seemingly trivial object can become a potent symbol in a larger conflict, and how stories, even if not entirely factual, can shape our understanding of history. Number 2. The mystery of the disappearing spy. Diver under a Soviet warship. It's April 1956. The Cold War is in full swing, and an icy tension hangs between the West and the Soviet Union. In a somewhat surprising diplomatic move, Soviet leaders Nikita Khrushchev and Nikolai Bulganin arrive in Portsmouth, England, for a high-profile state visit. They sailed in aboard the Soviet cruiser Ordzhonikidze, accompanied by 2 destroyers. This was meant to be a mission of goodwill, a chance to thaw relations a little. But British intelligence, MI6, saw an opportunity. The Ordzhonikidze was a new Sverdlov-class cruiser, and they were very keen to get a look at its underwater design, particularly its propellers and sonar dome. This kind of technical intelligence was highly valuable. So a rather risky covert operation was planned. Enter Commander Lionel Buster Crabbe. Crabbe was a famous British Royal Navy frogman and diving expert. He had gained renown during World War II for his work defusing Italian limpet mines in Gibraltar and Italy. By 1956, he was officially retired from the Navy, but still undertook occasional freelance work, sometimes for intelligence services. He was known for being brave, perhaps a bit reckless, and for pushing the limits. On April 19, 1956, while the Ordzhonikidze was moored in Portsmouth Harbor and the Soviet delegation was busy with diplomatic engagements, Crabbe, allegedly under MI6 direction, though this was and remains officially denied, undertook a clandestine dive to examine the Soviet cruiser's hull. He checked into the Sallyport Hotel in Portsmouth with an MI6 handler. He reportedly made at least 1 dive. Then he vanished. Commander Crabbe failed to return from his dive. His MI6 handler waited, then checked out of the hotel, taking Crabbe's belongings and even tearing the registration page out of the hotel guest book. For 10 days, there was silence. Then the Admiralty announced that Commander Crabbe was presumed dead, having not returned from a test dive in connection with trials of underwater apparatus in Stokes Bay, a location miles away from Portsmouth Harbor. This was clearly a cover story. Press, however, quickly grew suspicious. Why would a diver of Crabbe's experience go missing on a routine test dive? The Soviets, it turned out, had lodged a complaint. They reported seeing a frogman near the Ordzhonikidze on April 19. The story exploded in the British media. Prime Minister Anthony Eden was forced to make a statement in Parliament. He admitted Crabbe had dived, but said it was done without any permission whatever from Her Majesty's government, and that appropriate disciplinary steps are being taken. This did little to quell the speculation. It was a huge embarrassment for the British government. How could such an operation be mounted against a visiting head of state's flagship without official sanction? Or, if it was sanctioned, why deny it so clumsily? The fate of Buster Crabbe became a major mystery. What happened to him under the dark waters of Portsmouth Harbor? Did he drown accidentally? Did he suffer an equipment malfunction? Or was he caught by Soviet sailors? Over a year later, in June 1957, a body was found floating in Chichester Harbor, about 15 miles from Portsmouth. It was headless and missing both hands, making identification difficult. However, Crabbe's ex-wife and a close friend identified it as Crabbe, based on a distinctive scar on the leg and other features. Coroner recorded an open verdict. The theories continued to swirl. Some believed Crabbe was captured by the Soviets, interrogated, and either killed or defected, or was forced to work for them. A Soviet frogman who later defected to the West claimed that a Soviet sentry on the Ordzhonikidze had seen Crabbe and slit his throat with a knife as he surfaced. Another story suggested he was shot by a sniper. The Soviets themselves later hinted they had caught him and dealt with him. The Crabbe affair, as it came to be known, was a diplomatic disaster. It strained Anglo-Soviet relations at a delicate time. It exposed embarrassing lapses in British intelligence oversight and led to the resignation of the head of MI6, Sir John Sinclair. The full truth of what happened to Commander Lionel Buster Crabbe remains shrouded in Cold War's secrecy and speculation to this day. A chilling tale of espionage gone fatally wrong during a supposed moment of peace. Number 1. The time American diplomats were told, "Show us the money," by anonymous French agents. Imagine it's 1797. The young United States is trying to navigate a very tricky international scene. Its former ally, France, which had helped America win its independence from Britain, is now deep in the French Revolution and is at war with Great Britain and other European powers. The U.S., under President John Adams, is trying to stay neutral, but it's tough. France is angry that the U.S. signed the Jay Treaty with Britain, seeing it as a betrayal. French privateers start seizing American merchant ships, trading with Britain. Hundreds of ships are captured. Something has to be done. President Adams decides to send a diplomatic mission to Paris to negotiate a peaceful resolution. He appoints 3 prominent Americans: Charles Cotesworth, Pinckney, John Marshall, later the famous Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and Elbridge Gerry. Their mission is to meet with the French Foreign Minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord, often just called Talleyrand, and try to sort things out. When the American envoys arrive in Paris in October 1797, they find it surprisingly difficult to get an official audience with Talleyrand. Instead, they are approached by 3 shadowy figures, intermediaries who claim to be representing Talleyrand. These agents are later referred to in the official American dispatches and in history books by the letters X, Y, and Z to protect their identities, though their real names were Jean Conrad Hottinger, Pierre Bellamy, and Lucien Audeval. These agents, X, Y, and Z, lay out some rather shocking conditions before any formal negotiations can even begin. First, they demand a hefty bribe of 1.2 million livres, about $250,000 at the time, a massive sum, for Talleyrand personally. Second, they insist that the United States must provide France with a large loan. And third, President Adams must formally apologize for some anti-French remarks he had made in a speech to Congress. The American diplomats are stunned and outraged. This is not how international diplomacy is supposed to work. They are being asked for bribes and concessions just to get a seat at the negotiating table. Pinckney, Marshall, and Gerry refuse to pay any bribes. Pinckney is famously reported to have exclaimed, "No, no, not a sixpence." This was later popularized in the U.S. as millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. For months, the American envoys try to navigate this bizarre situation. They meet repeatedly with X, Y, and Z, hoping to find a way to bypass the demands for personal enrichment and start genuine talks. Elbridge Gerry, who is seen as more pro-French than the others, even tries to negotiate separately, hoping his perceived sympathies might help, but to no avail. Talleyrand continues to refuse to meet them officially unless his conditions are met. Frustrated and insulted, Pinckney and Marshall leave Paris in April 1798. Gerry stays on for a bit longer, still hoping for a breakthrough, but eventually he too gives up and heads home. When President Adams receives the dispatches from his envoys detailing these demands, he is furious. He presents the documents to Congress in March 1798, substituting the letters X, Y, and Z for the names of Talleyrand's agents. When these dispatches are made public, they cause an absolute uproar in the United States. Americans are incensed by the French government's arrogance and corruption. The slogan, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," sweeps the nation. The XYZ affair, as it became known, dramatically shifted American public opinion against France. It fueled anti-French sentiment and strengthened the Federalist Party, which favored a stronger national government and closer ties with Britain. Congress authorized the expansion of the U.S. Navy and Army. Although war was never formally declared, the U.S. and France engaged in an undeclared naval war known as the Quasi-War from 1798 to 1800. American warships and privateers were authorized to attack French shipping. Talleyrand, realizing he had seriously miscalculated and overplayed his hand, eventually backed down. He let it be known that he would receive a new American delegation without any preconditions or demands for bribes. By 1800, with Napoleon Bonaparte now in power in France, a new treaty, the Convention of 1800, also known as the Treaty of Mortefontaine, was negotiated, formally ending the Quasi-War and restoring peaceful relations between the United States and France. The XYZ affair was a defining moment in early American foreign policy. It demonstrated the young nation's determination to be treated with respect on the world stage and its unwillingness to submit to extortion even from a major European power. And it all started with those audacious demands from Messrs. X, Y, and Z.